Hi everyone! Thank you so much for joining me today at Breaking Ground. This is a report that or rather a directed study that I pursued with collaboration with SEED's Sustainability Program, Professor Susan Day, the head of the Urban Forestry Program, and Jeff Nolte from Building Operations. And I'm excited to show you what we sort of found, what recommendations we might be trying to gear ourselves towards, and I think why this research matters, really. So let's get into it. Here's a rough outline of what this presentation is going to look like today. We're going to talk about a couple of the research aims of this project, why it matters, why this research matters, what it's going to do, the asset management approach I'm taking, breaking it down a little bit more for everybody in the room, and then some of the findings, and then there'll be a discussion portion that everybody can sort of get to know each other through a little bit, and then hopefully in the Q&A I'll be able to talk a little bit more towards next steps, but maybe talk about it more with you rather than telling you what the next steps are following the discussion portion. So let's get started. The scope of this study was to deliver recommendations for improved practices in the university's management of its campus soils, particularly through a natural asset management approach. It's not complete yet, so the purpose of today's convening is to share my findings with you, and then I can shape my next step towards your needs or your thoughts more precisely. So hopefully this meeting will also provide ground for soil experts that I surveyed to make contact with campus and community staff who are interested in advancing green infrastructure policies and practices, and hopefully it just strengthens that relationship a little bit more and helps advance sustainability of green infrastructure on campus a little bit more. So there were three aims to this study. The first was to provide a rationale for why building operations should include soil in the new asset management software they're transitioning to called Plan-On. And really what this software does, from my understanding, is it delivers management and maintenance sort of schedules and reports so that building operations can manage their infrastructure more effectively. The second purpose is to identify what data gaps we have in understanding our urban soils and how they need to be addressed. And we're addressing that by identifying existing or potential sources to derive such data from urban landscapes on UBC's campus. So let's start off with why this study matters. It matters that we begin to assess our management of our campus soils and how we can improve them through asset management, because soils are an unrecognized facet of urban systems. Soil systems are integral to urban systems in that they provide a series of services that are typically ignored in an urban setting, but vital to life and vital to us in so many ways that we often take for granted because they already exist. So I've got a binocular lens kind of diagram here, and it really to show both the worst case and the best case scenario. It's important that we know about our soils, because in the best case scenario on our right, that way we know its value, we know its worth, we understand what services it's delivering for us, and we start to gain a real appreciation of urban ecosystems, particularly in what's beyond its intrinsic value. We start to understand the relationships between us and our natural environments around us. On the worst case scenario side, we also really do want to know more about our soils to mitigate risk. And a really good example that came out this year in March, actually, is that I don't know how to say their name, but the Bouge Group developers in Vancouver had a contract with the Vancouver School Board, actually, to renew a Kitsilano High School And then after the contract was negotiated, they actually found that the soil was contaminated, and asked for an increase in the budget and an increase, amendments to the schedule, to which the Vancouver School Board said, no, we're not going to be doing that. And so it's resulted in this whole legal case, with costs on both ends, with damage to reputation on both sides, and with a damaged relationship. So we really start to see, in a very interesting way, how soil begins to actually impact our professional relationships, and with each other, and also with development in the city. Without soil, we don't have cities, we don't have buildings. So it's really important that we understand what they are, how they're doing, and how we can really sort of maximize the benefits of the services that they deliver to us. This study also focuses on the cultural point exclusive to UBC. You can see that there's an air photo from 1938, and actually 8 years before this, there's another map that sort of shows how most of this was undeveloped, and there was just a lot of forestry logging roads. And 10 years prior to that photo, we actually know from Henry Logan's A History of the University of British Columbia, that a commission was set up, a committee was set up by academics on the request of the provincial government of BC, and they were set up to select a site somewhere across BC for this university. Where would the best place be? And after looking at Vancouver Island and looking at Coquitlam and looking at all of these other places, they settled on Point Grey. And I asked myself, why would they settle on Point Grey? It's a great place. It's got really nice views. It's got some strategic importance to it. But actually the real reason they chose Point Grey wasn't really any of those reasons. It was more that Point Grey had the best soil. It had the most fertile and the richest soil in the area. And what they recommended was that UBC actually have 250 acres for campus development and 700 acres for agricultural and forestry experimental studies, and in that way become a leading university that would contribute to BC's agricultural and BC's forestry economic sectors. So it's unfortunate that from having this incredible soil, we now don't really know what we have at all. And it's unfortunate that, following 1938, as you'll see, a lot of parking lots were developed. A lot of that soil has been taken out, and hopefully something that I can uncover in my study is where did that soil go? I'm sure it was placed somewhere else on campus, hopefully. Best case scenario. Fingers crossed. That kind of points to, let's go back one step, actually. One of the reasons that, that this didn't happen, that UBC didn't retain, that much land or get that much land was because of World War II, where financial resources suddenly had to go towards a completely different direction. And that meant that the university had to actually lean on their land, develop it so that they could support their academic core development. That's how the university, through creative financial planning, became such a great university. And this is why really we want to go into asset management. We want to understand how can we commit financial resources to the planning and the implementation of sustainable practices for green infrastructure. And one way is to really recognize that green infrastructure, which soil is a critical component of, it's the foundation of, is an asset and needs to be managed. So you can see here that the definition of green asset management is that it's a systematic process of maintaining, upgrading, and operating physical assets cost effectively. This approach is really meant to help address the rising cost and competing priorities that's embedded in decision making about infrastructure every day. And I would ignore the diagram on the left for the moment. What I really want to get into is what it breaks assets down into. It's asset management really breaks any asset that you take, so let's take soil, into 5 facets, and it breaks it down into its condition, its performance, its services, its life cycle cost, and its acceptable risk or criticality. And really the point of looking at soil as an asset is so that we can start to understand the state of our soils and how they function, what their health is like. We have an initiative in campus biodiversity initiative research and demonstration called Seabird. There's an initiative to baseline our natural assets, which is meant to support the emergence of an urban forest management plan or a biodiversity strategy. These initiatives exist for advancing sustainable planning at UBC, and we need to pair that up with asset management so that we can understand exactly how much we really need to commit to a long-sighted plan for improving our soils on campus. And really where we're at now is we're not at any of the steps that is on this framework. We're at baselining knowledge gaps. If you see the man here, typically this man will walk around in a circle on each of these spiral staircases following the loop at the top. And so we're really at baselining knowledge gaps for our inventory. We're at that very first step. We're at the -1 step, really. As this is an image that kind of breaks it down a little bit more for you in terms of how we want to start seeing our soils. And one of the challenges of parsing soil up in these 5 facets is that we may lose sight of the fact that soil is an ecosystem and as such needs to be managed as an ecosystem. So that's one of the challenges of balancing this view of something that can be taken apart and understood in all of its different parts and then bringing it back together as a new puzzle piece that forms an image of how soil works. So it's important, for example, to understand conditions so that we can understand the state of our soils. It's important to understand our performance so that we can understand whether our soils are functioning well. It's important to understand or identify what services we think are important to derive from the soil so that we have something to measure the performance and the condition up to. And then it's important to understand our inputs, like our life cycle cost. How much do we tend to invest in our soils? For example, how much does the purchase of mulch cost? How much is labor cost for managing our soils? And then with risk, what are the acceptable levels of risk with the management of our soils? Obviously, we can't let it get to a level where our soils are contaminated, but perhaps there are some levels of risk that we can through engineering studies and geoengineering studies, we can understand whether they actually affect humans and whether they actually affect biodiversity. But then, a criteria needs to be set up for these things as well. So it gets into a very complicated diorama of how do we start to see soil and yet reintegrate it after seeing it in all of these dissected perspectives. And for that reason, I surveyed 4 academic experts to try and understand how do we understand soil through all of these different facets and yet integrate it back in by identifying what data attributes really we need to look into. And so out of these 7 academic experts that I identified on campus, 4 responded. 2 of them responded through an online version of the survey that I sent out, and 2 of them responded through a phone call. And I would say that the phone call went much better in terms of gaining information than the online survey did. But what we did end up finding is that there were really these 4 camps of how the data should be collected. There was a camp that we need to understand, and these camps weren't from individuals that were surveyed. They were found across all individuals' answers. But really what we need to understand is, 1, the soil's biophysical state. I really cannot stress the importance of the biological aspect to our soils.